The courtroom was silent, the kind of silence that feels heavy, like the air itself is holding its breath. Everyone's eyes were fixed on the judge, a man known for his sharp tongue and even sharper biases. He sat high on his bench, his robe draped over his shoulders like a shield of authority, his face twisted into a scowl as he glared down at the young black teenager standing before him. She was just a kid, no older than 17, her hands trembling as she clutched the edges of the podium. Her crime, a minor traffic violation, but to this judge it was an opportunity to humiliate, to belittle, to remind her of her place. His words cut through the room like a knife dripping with condescension and thinly veiled racism. "Do you even understand the law?" he sneered, his voice laced with mockery. "Or are you just here to waste my time?" The teenager's face flushed with embarrassment, but she held her ground, her eyes flickering with something the judge didn't expect: defiance. What the judge didn't know, what no one in that courtroom knew, was that this wasn't just any teenager. Her name was Amara Johnson, and she was far more than she appeared. Behind her youthful face and nervous demeanor was a brilliant legal mind, a woman who had already earned her law degree and was working undercover for the state's Judicial Oversight Committee. Her mission? To investigate allegations of racial bias and misconduct in this very courtroom. This judge, with his inflated ego and unchecked power, had no idea he was speaking to someone who could dismantle his career with a single report. But Amara wasn't there to reveal herself. Not yet. She had to endure his insults, his arrogance, his blatant disrespect, all while gathering the evidence she needed to expose him. As the judge continued his tirade, Amara's mind raced. She thought about the countless others who had stood in this same spot, subjected to the same treatment, their voices silenced by the weight of his gavel. She thought about the system that allowed men like him to thrive, unchecked and unaccountable. And she thought about the moment she would finally reveal who she really was. But that moment wasn't now. Not yet. For now, she had to play the part to let him believe he had the upper hand. The tension in the room was palpable, a ticking time bomb waiting to explode. The judge leaned back in his chair, a smug smile playing on his lips, convinced he had put this ignorant kid in her place. But Amara's calm demeanor hid a storm brewing beneath the surface. She knew something he didn't. This wasn't the end. It was only the beginning. As the judge dismissed her case with a wave of his hand, Amara turned to leave the courtroom, her heart pounding in her chest. She could feel his eyes on her back, his satisfaction radiating through the room. But as she reached the door, she paused just for a moment and glanced over her shoulder. Their eyes met, and for the first time the judge felt a flicker of unease. There was something in her gaze, something he couldn't quite place. It was as if she knew something he didn't, as if she was holding on to a secret that could change everything. He shook it off, brushing it aside as paranoia. After all, what could a teenager possibly do to him? But as Amara stepped out into the hallway, a small, knowing smile tugged at the corners of her lips. The game was far from over, and the judge was about to learn that underestimating her would be his biggest mistake. The question was, what would happen when the truth finally came to light? And how far would he go to protect his reputation when the tables turned? The answers were coming, but not before the tension reached its breaking point. Amara stepped out of the courtroom, the heavy wooden door clicking shut behind her. The hallway was quieter now, the echoes of the judge's harsh words still ringing in her ears. She took a deep breath, steadying herself, and glanced down at the file in her hands. It was thin, almost laughably so. Just a few pages detailing the traffic violation she'd been charged with. But it wasn't the file that mattered. It was what she had witnessed inside that courtroom. The way the judge had spoken to her, the way he'd looked at her, the way he'd treated her as if she were less than human. It wasn't just about her. It was about every person who had ever stood before him, every person who had been silenced by his arrogance and prejudice. And Amara was determined to make sure it wouldn't happen again. She walked down the hallway, her heels clicking softly against the polished floor. Her mind was already racing, piecing together the next steps of her plan. She had been working on this investigation for months, ever since the first anonymous complaint had landed on her desk. The complaint had been vague at first, just a few lines about a judge who seemed to favor certain defendants over others, who seemed to have a particular disdain for people of color. But as Amara dug deeper, the pattern became clear. Judge Harold, Grayson wasn't just biased, he was a bully, a man who used his power to intimidate and humiliate those he deemed beneath him. And he had been getting away with it for years. Amara had spent weeks preparing for this moment. She had studied his cases, interviewed former defendants, and even spoken to a few court employees who were willing to talk off the record. What she found was disturbing. Time and time again, Judge Grayson had shown a blatant disregard for fairness, often ruling against black and brown defendants with little to no evidence. He had a reputation for being harsh, for handing down maximum sentences, for minor offenses, and for making snide, racially charged comments from the bench. But proving it was another matter. The judicial system was notoriously difficult to crack, and Grayson had powerful friends who were all too willing to protect him. That's why Amara had decided to go undercover. She needed to see him in action, to witness his behavior firsthand, and to gather enough evidence to make sure he couldn't weasel his way out of accountability. As she reached the end of the hallway, Amara pulled out her phone and typed a quick message to her supervisor. "Phase 1 complete," she wrote. He took the bait. She hit send and slipped the phone back into her pocket, her mind already turning to the next phase of the plan. She knew Grayson would be watching her now, that he would be curious about the teenager who had stood up to him in his courtroom. And that was exactly what she wanted. She needed him to feel confident, to believe he was untouchable, because the more comfortable he felt, the more mistakes he would make, and Amara would be there to catch every single one. But as she stepped out of the courthouse and into the bright afternoon sun, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. She glanced around, her eyes scanning the busy street, but there was no one there, just the usual crowd of lawyers, defendants, and courthouse staff milling about. Still, the feeling lingered, a prickling sensation at the back of her neck. She shook it off, telling herself it was just nerves. After all, she was playing a dangerous game, and the stakes couldn't be higher. If Grayson found out who she really was, if he realized she was investigating him, the consequences could be catastrophic. Not just for her, but for everyone who had been counting on her to bring him to justice. Amara made her way to a small cafe a few blocks from the courthouse, a place she had scouted out earlier as a safe spot to regroup. She ordered a coffee and found a seat in the corner, away from prying eyes. As she sipped her drink, she pulled out a notebook and began jotting down everything she had observed in the courtroom. The way Grayson had spoken to her, the way he had treated the other defendants, the way he had seemed to relish in his own power. It was all important. Every detail mattered. But as she wrote, her thoughts kept drifting back to the look in his eyes when she had turned to leave the courtroom. That flicker of unease, that moment of doubt. It had been brief, almost imperceptible, but it was there, and it gave her hope. She knew Grayson wasn't going to go down without a fight. He was a man who had spent his entire career building a reputation, a man who had clawed his way to the top and wasn't about to let anyone take it away from him. But Amara had something he didn't, a sense of purpose, a belief in justice, and a determination to see this through no matter what. She had seen firsthand what happened when people like Grayson were allowed to operate without consequences. She had seen the lives that were ruined, the families that were torn apart, the communities that were left broken and distrustful of the system, and she wasn't going to let it continue. Not on her watch. As she finished her coffee and packed up her things, Amara's phone buzzed. It was a message from her supervisor. "Be careful," it read. "He's not the only one watching." Amara frowned, her fingers hovering over the screen. What did that mean? Was someone else onto her? Or was it just a warning to stay vigilant? She didn't have time to dwell on it. She had a meeting to get to, a meeting that could change everything. But as she stepped out of the cafe and into the bustling street, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The air felt heavier somehow, the noise of the city more oppressive. She glanced over her shoulder, her eyes scanning the crowd, but there was no one there. Just the usual faces, the usual chaos. Still, the feeling lingered, a nagging sense of unease that she couldn't quite place. Amara quickened her pace, her mind racing as she walked. She had to stay focused, had to keep her eye on the prize. But as she turned the corner and headed toward her destination, she couldn't help but wonder, what was she walking into? And who else was playing this game? The answers were out there, waiting to be uncovered. But as Amara knew all too well, the truth often came with a price. And she was about to find out just how high that price could be. Amara arrived at the nondescript office building on the edge of town, the kind of place that blended into the background, unnoticed by most. It was the perfect location for her meeting, private, discreet, and far enough from the courthouse to avoid prying eyes. She took the elevator to the 4th floor, her heart pounding with a mix of anticipation and unease. The message from her supervisor still lingered in her mind. He's not the only one watching. Who else could be involved, and what did they know? The door to the office was slightly ajar, and Amara pushed it open to find her supervisor, Marcus, sitting at a cluttered desk. He was a tall, broad-shouldered man with a no-nonsense demeanor, but today his usual calm was replaced by a tense energy. He looked up as she entered, his expression grim. "You made it," he said, gesturing for her to sit. "We've got a problem." Amara's stomach dropped. "What kind of problem?" she asked, taking a seat across from him. Marcus leaned forward, his voice low. "We've been tracking Grayson's connections. Turns out he's not just some small-town judge with a big ego. He's tied to some powerful people, politicians, business leaders, even a few high-ranking law enforcement officials. If we take him down, it's not just him we're going after. It's an entire network." Amara's mind raced. She had suspected Grayson had allies, but this was bigger than she had imagined. "So what are you saying?" she asked. "We back off?" Marcus shook his head. "No, but we need to be careful. If they find out what we're doing, they'll come after us and they won't play fair." He paused, his eyes locking onto hers. "You need to know what you're up against, Amara. This isn't just about Grayson anymore. It's about taking down a system that's been rigged for decades." Amara nodded, her resolve hardening. She had known this wouldn't be easy, but she hadn't realized just how deep the corruption went. Still, she couldn't back down now. Too many people were counting on her. "What's the next step?" she asked. Marcus handed her a folder. "We've got a lead on one of Grayson's associates, a lawyer named Daniel Carter. He's been handling a lot of Grayson's dirty work, and we think he might be willing to talk. But he's skittish. If we're going to get to him, we need to move fast." Amara flipped through the folder, scanning the details. Daniel Carter was a mid-level attorney with a reputation for cutting corners. He wasn't a big player, but he was close enough to Grayson to know where the bodies were buried. If they could get him to cooperate, it could be the break they needed. "I'll reach out to him," she said. "But if Grayson's people are watching, we need to be smart about it." Marcus nodded. "Agreed. We'll set up a meeting, but you'll need to go in undercover. If Carter suspects anything, he'll bolt and we'll lose our shot." As Amara left the office, her mind was already working through the details. She needed a cover story, something that would get Carter to, trust her. But more than that, she needed to stay one step ahead of Grayson and his allies. The stakes were higher than ever, and the margin for error was razor thin. Later that evening, Amara found herself at a dimly lit bar on the outskirts of the city. It was the kind of place where deals were made in shadows, and no one asked too many questions. She had arranged to meet Carter here, posing as a freelance journalist working on a story about judicial corruption. It was a risky move, but it was the only way to get close to him without raising suspicion. Carter arrived a few minutes later, his eyes darting around the room as if he expected to be ambushed at any moment. He was a wiry man in his late 30s, with a nervous energy that made him seem perpetually on edge. Amara waved him over, and he slid into the booth across from her. "You're the reporter?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "That's me," Amara said, forcing a smile. Thanks for meeting me. I know this is sensitive. Carter nodded, his fingers drumming nervously on the table. Yeah, well, let's just say I've got my reasons for talking. But if anyone finds out I was here, I'm dead. You understand? I do, Amara said, leaning in slightly. And anything you tell me will be completely confidential. I just want the truth. Carter hesitated, his eyes scanning the room again. Then, in a low voice, he began to talk. He told her about Grayson's connections, about the bribes and backroom deals, about the cases that had been rigged to protect the powerful and punish the vulnerable. It was worse than Amara had imagined, a web of corruption that stretched far, beyond Grayson. But as Carter spoke, she noticed something else, a flicker of guilt, of regret. This wasn't just a man looking to save his own skin. This was someone who had realized too late that he was on the wrong side. When Carter finally finished, he looked at Amara with a mixture of fear and desperation. "You've got what you need," he said. "Now get me out of this. I can't keep living like this." Amara nodded, her mind racing. She had the information she needed, but getting Carter out wouldn't be easy. Grayson's people were watching, and if they caught wind of what was happening, it would all be over. "I'll do what I can," she said, "but you need to lay low. Don't talk to anyone. Don't do anything that might draw attention. I'll be in touch." As she left the bar, Amara felt the weight of the situation pressing down on her. She had the evidence she needed to take Grayson down, but the cost of doing so was higher than ever. And as she walked through the quiet streets, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. The shadows seemed to close in around her, and every sound felt like a warning. She knew the next steps would be the hardest. Grayson wasn't just a man, he was a symbol of a broken system. And taking him down would mean taking on that system itself. But Amara wasn't alone. She had allies, people who believed in what she was doing. And as she thought about the faces of those who had been wronged by Grayson, she felt a surge of determination. This wasn't just about justice, it was about hope. And she wasn't going to let that hope die. The question was, how far would Grayson and his allies go to protect their power? And how much was Amara willing to risk to stop them? The answers were coming, but not before the tension reached its breaking point. And as the night deepened, Amara knew one thing for certain. This was only the beginning. Amara's apartment felt smaller than usual, the walls closing in as she spread the evidence across her kitchen table. Documents, photos, and handwritten notes from Carter covered every inch of the surface, each piece a thread in the tangled web of Grayson's corruption. She had been up all night, piecing it together, connecting the dots. The more she uncovered, the more she realized how deep this went. Grayson wasn't just a corrupt judge, he was a linchpin in a system designed to protect the powerful and crush the vulnerable, and now she had the proof to expose him. But as she stared at the mountain of evidence, a chilling thought crept into her mind. What if it's not enough? Grayson had friends in high places, people who would do anything to keep their secrets buried, and if they found out what she was planning, they wouldn't hesitate to silence her. The weight of that realization pressed down on her, but she couldn't afford to hesitate. Too much was at stake. Her phone buzzed, snapping her out of her thoughts. It was Marcus. "We've got a problem," he said, his voice tense. "Carter's gone missing." Amara's heart skipped a beat. "What do you mean, missing?" "I mean, he didn't show up for work today, and he's not answering his phone. His apartment's empty too. It's like he just vanished." Amara's mind raced. Carter had been scared, but he had seemed willing to cooperate. If he had disappeared, it could only mean one thing. Grayson's people had found out. "We need to move fast," she said. "If they've got Carter, they'll know everything he told me. They'll be coming for us next." Marcus was silent for a moment, then said, "I'll put a team together. We'll meet at the safe house in an hour. Be careful, Amara. If they're watching, they'll be looking for you." Amara hung up and quickly gathered the evidence, her hands trembling slightly as she stuffed it into a bag. She grabbed her coat and headed for the door, but as she reached for the handle, she froze. There was a sound outside, a faint shuffling, like someone trying to be quiet. Her heart pounded as she pressed her ear to the door, listening. The sound came again, closer this time. Someone was out there. She backed away from the door, her mind racing. If they were already here, she had to get out, now. She moved to the window, peering through the blinds. The street below was quiet, but she could see a dark car parked across the street, its engine running. There was no time to think. She grabbed her bag and slipped out the back door, moving quickly and quietly through the alley behind her building. Her car was parked a block away, and she forced herself to walk calmly, not wanting to draw attention. But with every step, she felt like a target, exposed and vulnerable. When she reached her car, she slid into the driver's seat and locked the doors, her hands shaking as she started the engine. She glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone following her, but the street was empty. For now. She pulled out onto the road, her mind racing. The safe house was on the other side of town, a nondescript building where Marcus and his team would be waiting. But getting there wouldn't be easy. If Grayson's people were watching, they'd be looking for her car, her face, anything that could lead them to her. As she drove, she kept her eyes on the road, but her thoughts were elsewhere. She thought about Carter, about what might have happened to him. She thought about Grayson sitting in his courtroom, oblivious to the storm that was coming. And she thought about all the people who had been hurt by his corruption, the lives that had been destroyed because of his greed and prejudice. She couldn't let him win. Not now, not when she was so close. But as she turned onto the highway, she noticed something in the rearview mirror, a black SUV, keeping a steady distance behind her. Her stomach dropped. She changed lanes, and the SUV followed. She sped up, and it did the same. They were tailing her. Amara's hands tightened on the wheel as she tried to think. She couldn't lead them to the safe house. If they found out where Marcus and the team were, it would all be over. She had to lose them, but how? The highway was busy, the traffic thick, but the SUV was persistent, weaving through the cars behind her. She needed a plan, and she needed it fast. Up ahead, she saw an exit for a shopping mall. It was crowded, chaotic, the perfect place to disappear. She signaled at the last second and swerved onto the exit ramp, the SUV following close behind. The mall was just a few blocks away, and she drove straight into the parking garage, weaving through the rows of cars until she found a spot near the entrance. She parked and grabbed her bag, slipping out of the car and into the crowd of shoppers. She moved quickly, blending in with the crowd, her heart pounding as she glanced over her shoulder. The SUV had pulled into the garage, but they hadn't seen her yet. She had a head start, but it wouldn't last long. Inside the mall, she ducked into a restroom and pulled out her phone, typing a quick message to Marcus. "I'm being followed. Can't make it to the safe house. Meet me at the backup location." She hit send and slipped the phone back into her pocket, her mind racing. The backup location was a small diner on the edge of town, a place they had agreed on in case of emergencies. But getting there would be risky. If they were watching the roads, they'd be watching the diner too. Amara took a deep breath, trying to steady her nerves. She had come too far to give up now. She had the evidence, the proof that could bring Grayson down. But getting it into the right hands wouldn't be easy. The stakes were higher than ever, and the danger was closing in. As she stepped out of the restroom and into the crowded mall, she knew one thing for certain. This was the calm before the storm. And the storm was coming. The question was, who would survive it? Amara moved through the mall with purpose, her bag clutched tightly to her side. She kept her head down, blending into the sea of shoppers, but her eyes darted constantly, scanning for any sign of the men in the black SUV. The mall was a maze of stores and corridors, and she used it to her advantage, weaving through the crowd, and doubling back to throw off anyone who might be following her. She could feel the weight of the evidence in her bag, a constant reminder of what was at stake. Every step felt like a gamble, every turn a risk. But she had no choice. She had to get to the diner. She had to meet Marcus. As she neared the mall's exit, her phone buzzed in her pocket. She pulled it out, her heart sinking as she read the message from Marcus. "Can't make it to the diner. Compromised. Find another way. Amara stared at the screen, her mind racing. If Marcus was compromised, that meant Grayson's people had found the safe house. They were closing in on every angle, cutting off her options one by one. She was on her own. She slipped out of the mall and into the parking lot, her eyes scanning for a way out. The black SUV was still there, parked near the entrance, its windows tinted and menacing. She couldn't risk going back to her car. She needed another plan. Spotting a taxi idling near the curb, she hurried over and slid into the back seat. "Just drive," she said to the driver, her voice low and urgent. "Anywhere. But here." The taxi pulled away, and Amara glanced out the back window, her stomach churning as she saw the SUV start to move. They were following her again. She turned to the driver, her mind working quickly. "Change of plans," she said. "Take me to the courthouse." The driver raised an eyebrow but didn't argue. As the taxi sped through the city streets, Amara's thoughts were a whirlwind. The courthouse was the last place Grayson would expect her to go. It was bold, maybe even reckless, but it might be her only chance. She had the evidence, and if she could get it into the right hands, someone who wasn't tied to Grayson's network, she might still have a shot at exposing him. But getting into the courthouse unnoticed wouldn't be easy, especially with Grayson's people hot on her trail. When the taxi pulled up to the courthouse, Amara paid the driver and stepped out, her eyes scanning the area. The SUV was nowhere in sight, but she knew they couldn't be far behind. She took a deep breath and walked up the steps, her bag slung over her shoulder. The courthouse was busy, a steady stream of people coming and going, and she used the crowd to her advantage, slipping inside without drawing attention. She made her way to the clerk's office where she knew she could file the evidence anonymously. It wasn't ideal, but it was the safest option she had left. But as she approached the office, she froze. Standing near the door was a man she recognized, one of Grayson's associates, a lawyer who had been in the courtroom the day she had faced the judge. He was talking to a court clerk, his voice low and urgent. Amara's heart pounded as she ducked behind a pillar, her mind racing. If they were already here, that meant Grayson knew she had the evidence. And if they were intercepting filings, there was no way she could risk leaving it with the clerk. She backed away, her mind scrambling for another plan. She needed someone she could trust, someone who wasn't part of Grayson's network. And then it hit her. Judge Eleanor Hayes. Hayes was a respected judge known for her integrity, someone who had clashed with Grayson in the past. If anyone would be willing to help, it was her. But getting to Hayes wouldn't be easy. Her chambers were on the 3rd floor, and Amara would have to get past security to reach her. Amara moved quickly, heading for the stairs. She couldn't risk the elevators, where she might be trapped. As she climbed the steps, her phone buzzed again. It was an unknown number, and the message sent a chill down her spine. "We know where you are. Stop now, or it won't end well. For you." She deleted the message and shoved the phone back into her pocket, her resolve hardening. They were trying to scare her, to make her back down, but she was done running. When she reached the 3rd floor, she paused outside Judge Hayes's chambers, her hand hovering over the door. This was it, her last chance. She knocked, and after a moment the door opened. Judge Hayes stood there, her expression one of surprise. "Can I help you?" she asked. Amara stepped inside and closed the door behind her. "Your Honor, my name is Amara Johnson. I'm an attorney with the Judicial Oversight Committee, and I need your help." She opened her bag and pulled out the evidence, spreading it across the judge's desk. "This is proof of corruption involving Judge Grayson and his associates. But they're on to me, and if I don't get this into the right hands, it will disappear." Judge Hayes stared at the documents, her face a mask of shock and anger. "This is unbelievable," she said, her voice low. "If what you're saying is true, this could bring down half the courthouse." "It's true," Amara said, "but Grayson's people are watching. They've already compromised my team and they're coming for me. I need your help to make sure this doesn't get buried." Judge Hayes nodded, her expression grim. "You've done the right thing by coming to me. But if they're as connected, as you say, we need to move carefully. One wrong step and this could blow up in our faces. As they began to strategize, Amara felt a flicker of hope. She wasn't alone anymore. But that hope was short-lived. Outside the chambers, she heard voices, angry, urgent. The door handle rattled, and Amara's heart stopped. They had found. Her Judge Hayes stood, her eyes narrowing. "Stay behind me," she said, her voice firm. But Amara knew it wouldn't be that simple. Grayson's people weren't going to stop, not when they were this close to silencing her for good. The door burst open, and Amara braced herself. The final showdown was here, and there was no turning back. The question was, who would walk away? And at what cost?